G'day folks, Ziggy here. I'm about to drop a maximum effort video on you. Dozens of hours of tinkering and research here. I have no idea how long this video will end up being, so use chapters to jump around if your attention starts to wander, and consider this my Christmas present to you this year. Now, from the new transfigured gems, Viper Strike of the Mamba really grabbed my attention. It's an awesomely designed skill. Poison builds normally just stack tons of poisons and scale up the duration as much as possible, so they generally build and play somewhat similarly, a lot of spam usually. Mamba Strike leans hard in the opposite direction. You cannot poison an already poisoned enemy with this skill, so you get a huge amount of bonus poison damage for that limitation. I'm getting almost 300% more poison damage just from the Mamba Strike gem itself in my current setup. With this build, we lean into the idea of a big single poison, stacking low tolerance style effects that give huge amounts of increased damage for the first poison you apply to an enemy. And then, like all good action RPG builds, we cheat. We bypass the single poison per enemy restriction with Pathfinder's Master Toxicist, which spreads the single strongest poison from each enemy to other nearby enemies on death. This node is normally very nice, but in this build it's insane. Firstly, we are built around making a very high damage single poison, way beyond what this node was originally designed for. Secondly, this poison proliferation also has its own duration, not reduced by the support gems linked to Viper Strike, letting it last something like 5 times longer than Mamba's poisons, but at the same poison DPS. And finally, these proliferated poisons can stack, ignoring Mamba Strike's limitation of only one poison and stacking a gigantic poison that was not designed to be stacked. So what does all this mean? We tap packs, we boop them, and everything in range dies almost instantly. I've had a ton of fun figuring this build out and optimizing it to a decent level. It's a really interesting design, and it's been a very fun one to play with and tinker with the mechanics of. This might actually be one of my favorite builds of all time for that. It's been so fun to deconstruct it and build it up over time. I just keep wanting to play it as well and improve it more and more. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the build, let me first give you as honest as I can appraisal of the build so that you can decide if it's for you. I'll do my best to be unbiased here, but I'm definitely biased because I love this character and it's been a fun process to actually work on over time. So firstly, the biggest pro by far for this build is that it has basically no visual effects or spam. So that means no frame drops and no eye bleed. I can actually see the monsters and what they're doing, and it's beautiful and oh so rare these days. It is the most visually clear build I've played in all of Path of Exile, and it is gorgeous. Now this is an okay but not great build to level. Thankfully, Affliction's Oath of the Magi makes everything great to level this league, so it wasn't really a big deal, but generally strike builds aren't really designed to crush the campaign. Check the leveling section for how you can work around this though. Regular mapping is very good, but it can't compete with top-end projectile builds, right? You still have to walk up to the pack. Still, it's fast moving in both movement speed and whirling blades, and when you do get to each pack, you mostly just one-tap them and the pack dies. Map bosses mostly all have extra monsters as well, so you can generally just delete them, and we have some solutions for the stubborn ones that I'll talk about later. Juiced up mapping is excellent. Same comparison to top-end projectile builds, obviously they still reign supreme, since you just have to get near the monsters, but this build actually gets stronger the more monsters there are on screen. Delirium, Beyond, Abyss, anything that adds a ton of monsters, Eater and Exarch influence, all are excellent on this build, and stacking them all together is even better. The more stack mechanics, the more monsters you spawn, the better the build performs. It's so satisfying to pop an entire expedition and wipe out most of them with just a few attacks from the edges. This build also does really well in certain specialized content too. Anything that has monsters stacked on top of each other basically, you should consider trying on this build and seeing how it goes. In particular, I found it to be particularly cracked in Blight, because all the monsters are just lined up in a conga line. You could just spam chilling in temporal towers and force the mobs to slow down and bunch up, and then one tap in entire lanes, including the bosses often just disappearing from the proliferation. This character has also been the easiest Blight Ravaged maps I've ever done. I actually struggled with them in the past on some previous characters, but this is super easy. The bosses tend to have so much HP that they survive even stacked prolifs in Blight Ravaged maps, but you can just like freeze them and then focus them down with towers, it works just fine. I've barely leaked a single monster to the pump in a bunch of Blight Ravaged maps that I've run. It's fun and profitable. Here's a quick overview list of my thoughts on how the build performs in some different types of content for your evaluation. Light A+, they line up to die to proliferation, what more can you want? Expedition A+, the Giga Explosive in maps creates one giant blob of prolif awaiting monsters, and logbooks have been fine too. I've been able to do any logbooks and all of the content in them. Abyss is also A+, it spawns a lot of stacked monsters. Again, what more can you want? Delirium and Simulacrum are probably an A. Good density boosts proliferation, and survivability is very good in this content. You can do wave 30 Simulacrums on it, unless you get unlucky with a boosted Chaos Res life stacking boss with extra damage, like I did in the last one that I run. The only real weakness is when you get a boss with no ads around and you don't have your Vile Breach up, and it's particularly tanky with stacked mods and whatnot. Beyond is also an A. More monsters is more goodera for this build, and sometimes you one-shot the bosses when they spawn with mods around them as well. Heist and Delve are like a question mark A. This build is fast and proliferation is pretty good in that content, but Heist was a bit too laggy for me to test properly. Other people did say that it's solid in that content though. And I only did a few level 80 plus delves and a boss in the delve, and it felt pretty good, but I can't directly attest as I didn't do much more than that. I didn't do any deep delving or anything. Breach is B+. It's good, but you kind of have to run around the circle. You can't just like off screen with projectiles, which is what Breach really wants. Breach all domains will be fine though. Legion is a C. Sometimes you actually one-tap the entire Legion and it feels great, and that makes you want to spec the Legion nodes, but then other times you run around and the mobs are too spaced out for proliferation. They like spawn just about 2 meters apart or a little bit over 2 meters apart, so they don't prolif properly, and you're like running around attacking a few monsters at a time, so then you kind of hate life. So I don't really recommend specking Legion on this build. Legion just really favors ranged spam. And then bossing in general is probably a B+ overall, averaging out. All of the normal bosses are quite easy, and anything with ads is super easy. I did all of the bosses in the game, except for like Uber level 85 bosses, and they were all great and pretty easy overall by the end. Uber level 85 bosses will be pretty hard though, unless you are particularly good at the fights. I never really planned on doing them on this character, and you could probably push it to that point, especially if you are decent at the fights, but I think if you really want to focus on Uber bosses, you should explicitly make a character designed to phase them as quickly as possible. That's kind of the way to go with them. So for that content, pick another build. This one's better suited to other forms of content like we've talked about. Next up, survivability on the build in general sense. This is always pretty contextual, and part of it's kind of rolled into my previous evaluations, but in isolation it's pretty solid, 9 out of 10, which is certainly good enough for most content in softcore. The biggest drawback is obviously that you have to get within 2 meters of an enemy to hit them at least once. This is fine for most stuff, but not really for like quad ghosted tier 17 puzzle box guardian bosses. You need a truly cracked build for that content. I will note that there are item and build variations I'll talk about later that can boost survivability further, but I've really had more than enough to do everything I wanted, and I'd rate this character very good in all of the content that I've taken it into. Certainly good enough for softcore, definitely no glass cannon. Finally, fun and interest factor, an important thing to evaluate. Personally, I loved it. I cannot get enough of this build. This is god tier fun in the context of strike builds. There's more fun to be had in maybe other areas, but I kind of love this. It is a melee-ish build, so it's a little higher effort than some builds, and it does have a few buttons to press between Withering Step, Plague Bearer, Vile Grace, Malevolence, and so on. But this is kind of balanced out by Flasks being automated and really nice in my opinion. Pathfinder feels really good to play right now. Overall, it's got a very fun and unique playstyle, and it's interesting mechanically, and I love it. Okay, now let's talk how to physically play this build. Mapping is simple as walk or whirling blades up to each pack and tap them once or twice until the first monster or two dies. So as long as your flasks are up, which they'll be automated to always be up at endgame, proliferation takes care of the rest. Any little stray mobs can be cleaned up with Plague Bearer to save you from having to catch them with a Viper Strike. If there's any super annoying little things that run away, I just can't tend to skip them these days, honestly. There's pretty easy map sustain in Path of Exile right now. Whenever there's a boss or a nastier monster, try to round up a few regular monsters and stack them together before you attack to proliferate your poisons onto the nastier enemy or the boss. Anything that needs more damage can have Withering Step instantly apply near max wither stacks on them to vastly increase their poison damage taken. It's best to tap Withering Step right as you walk up to engage or right before you attack. Since we have very short poison duration and even the proliferations are pretty fast, you kind of want those wither stacks to be applied just before you actually do that poison. Other than that, try to keep up your extra blessing aura active by recasting it whenever it drops off, and use Vile Grace when you get to engage more dangerous enemies. Vile Breach, once you get one, is saved only really for tough bosses without a bunch of adds on them, or for any special encounters that need just a little bit of extra proliferation juice. Something like a Beyond or a Delirium boss, for example. Some of those can be pretty tanky. You don't need Vile Breach very often, and you don't technically even need to run it in general, but it's a very nice tool to have in your back pocket. For very dangerous content, like for example a stacked up expedition, you want to engage at the edge of the pack with some hit and run tactics, using Vile Grace as you move in and Withering Step and Plague Bearer right as you go to attack. All you need to do is get those initial kills to get your proliferation chain started, and then it'll take care of the rest, so hit and run can work very well. For bossing without proliferation, you're much more actively attacking, almost like a regular attack build. Activate Withering Step whenever it's off cooldown to maintain your Wither stacks, and use Plague Bearer whenever it reaches maximum damage. Keep your Blessing Malevolence up by recasting it if it's disabled due to both minions dying at once, and otherwise wail away on the enemy. Okay, now let's get into talking about the dirty details of the build, where the real fun begins. Feel free to just check out Path of Building link if you don't want to know what and why and how and just want to play, or you can click around to the sections you need to know more about specifically, it's all up to you. First, let's talk about my skill gem setup and some variations. I've done quite a bit of testing of different things here, so I feel like I have a pretty good picture of all of the different tools available at our disposal. Viper Strike of the Mamba, quality is huge, so prioritize qualitying it up or buying a high quality one to begin with. After much testing, my preferred support gem setup is in order of priority: Sadism, Multi-Strike, Deadly Ailments, Swift Affliction, and Melee Physical. Sadism is the core of the build. You want that duration as low as possible, and it's the best damage gem by far for this build. Using it actually allows you to increase your DPS with a little bit of attack speed, as you can keep applying short duration poisons rather than just kind of sitting there twiddling your thumbs while waiting for a poison to expire. Multi-Strike was a surprising one, but its damage penalty doesn't apply to poison, while the bonus on second and third attacks actually does. Mostly it helps smooth out mana costs, as the repeats are free, and it makes the build feel better to play with auto-targeting and faster attack speed. Deadly Ailment solves Reflect completely, we're essentially immune, and Swift Affliction is just a baby version of Sadism and well worth using. Melee Fizz is another surprise, but it gives around 50% more damage with poison regardless of where that poison damage actually comes from, even though we're almost a completely elemental build at this point. The attack speed penalty is actually kind of helpful for ensuring that we don't waste attacks on already poisoned enemies. I did a lot of fiddling with attack speed stuff, I'll talk about that later in the video. Overall though, Melee Fizz is just one of the best gems for getting big fat proliferations on your first hit, which is kind of the only downside of Multi-Strike, that it doesn't contribute to that. Now, other skills. Alchemist Mark is generally pretty weak on poison builds, but not in this one. It puts down Caustic Ground based on the strongest poison on an enemy hit. It increases my total damage over time DPS in this build for single target by a whopping 70%. It'd be a little stronger if you manually cast it, sure, but that's just unfeasible. And you want it to be proccing like on every rare that you go to attack. It's far better to just automate it with Mark on Hit to apply to any rares and bosses that we attack. I put Alchemist Mark, Mark on Hit, and Withering Step together in a 4-link with Enhance. Level 3 is only like 30 chaos right now, and it's a huge boost to both Alchemist and Withering Step. Make sure that they're both qualityed up as well, as it's a huge damage boost in this setup. A quality boosted Withering Step also means that we don't need a stupid Wither Totem, which I hate those things. Once you get Ashes Amulet as well, I'll talk about later, you actually get like nearly capped Wither stacks just off Withering Step. It's perfect. Now the first Claw 3-link is Whirling Blades. It goes with faster attacks and a level 1 Brutality. Brutality disables the poison on the skill, so you won't accidentally poison an enemy with a weak-ass poison, leaving you unable to Viper Strike them for a second or so. It's not essential, but it's kind of just good quality of life to have. Honestly, with the short duration poison, you could just wait it out and not worry about it, if you're not really Whirling Bladesing onto bosses all that often anyway. It's kind of a playstyle thing. Feel free to use the Brutality socket for like a dash or something, if you absolutely must have a jump skill, which I don't run one. The second link is Plague Bearer, used to boost single target damage and to clear out stragglers. You actually don't want to overuse this on trash mobs in this build, as it can kind of kill them before you Viper Strike, preventing you from proliferating off them. It's a little different to regular poison builds, which tend to use Plague Bearer a little more actively in clearing to smooth out their clear. It's not needed for clear on this build, it's more of a single target boost. Vile Grace and Precision go in the gem sockets aside Plague Bearer for me. Level up Precision as high as you can without going out of mana constantly, which might only be level 1, and that's okay, it's not really crucial. Make sure you have at least 56 mana unreserved at endgame for Mark on hit with my particular setup for Alchemist Mark. If you feel like Alchemist Mark never triggers on rares or bosses, check that you actually have enough unreserved mana for it to actually trigger. It does cost mana. And if you're having mana issues, de-level Precision first before looking for other options. I'll talk more about some mana solutions in the passive tree section. Petrified Blood works very well in a life flask scaling Pathfinder setup like this, as you get insane healing and can even fill your health bar back up to full. Petrified Blood makes your life bar look a little bit scary if you're not used to using it, but it's actually a huge boost to survivability, like insane. Way beyond even what Path of Building says it does. It actually lets us better take advantage of the powerful life flask setup that we have, and effectively treating life flask healing as like another layer of damage mitigation because of that staggered damage effect that it does. It's insanely good, and I actually didn't use Petrified Blood for quite some time, thinking that I couldn't really fit it in the build, but I made some swaps and actually ended up with net positive overall, and Petrified Blood without and with is just like night and day for survivability. It's so good with this build. You can put Steel Skin on left click for some low effort extra defense, and I like to throw in a Vile Breach, aka a Vile Portal, with fast casting to summon extra proliferation targets in boss fights. If you can get a high quality Vile Breach, that helps with the cast time as well. It's a bit slow by default. Finally, in a previous video I explained how you can use Dark Marionettes, one of the new corpses, to get an extra aura for a few gem sockets. I use Malevolence with Guardian's Blessing and Meat Shield support, and Raised Spectre with 2 imperfect Dark Marionette corpses. It's a very cheap setup, but it does cost a few gem sockets, but there's nothing here that's actually better than this in my mind. You do have to recast this sometimes in combat when both of the minions die at the exact same time, but Meat Shield makes this less frequent, and it's an instant cast skill anyway, so it's really not too bad. It's certainly well worth the solid 40% DPS increase we get for the effort. The minions also occasionally taunt bosses as well, lowering the damage they do to us thanks to the Meat Shield support. Let's talk about a couple quick variations. If you don't like Petrified Blood, you're crazy, but I know not everyone does, so you can drop some damage nodes and get the aura nodes between Shadow and Ranger to run Barkskin and Herald of Agony instead. It's a bit less defense, about the same damage, but the Herald of Agony kind of makes up for the loss in damage that you get from dropping the nodes to pick up the aura cluster, so it works out pretty much the same. You can also get the nodes behind Barkskin on the Magi to get a little bit of extra ailment defense, though it's a bit unreliable. I wouldn't rely on it. And for the Guardian's Blessing, if you hate the Marionette setup for whatever reason, it's a big damage loss, but you could either fill those sockets with some other utility gems of your choosing, or take Oath of the Magi and leave your gloves, boots, or helmet empty for either 25% life, 30% move speed, or a bunch of resist to make gearing easier. I've seen people doing that at endgame, it's perfectly fine. Alright, time for a big section in the video, gearing. Let's talk claws first. For your claws, you want high total raw added damage, ignoring attack speed. This is a little tricky to search for on Path of Building if you're not used to it, because the only ways of sorting weapons is by DPS, which is the damage multiplied by the attack speed. But we don't really care about the attack speed that much. To an extent, it can help with single target. I'll talk about later in the DPS maximizing section. But what we want is the biggest single hit of damage available, the most added flat damage. So this can be Fizz, Chaos, or Elemental, but generally you'll find the highest values are going to be Elemental. There's just more of it. On the suffixes for the claws, you want Damage Over Time Multiplier or Chaos Damage Over Time Multiplier, ideally both. If you find the former with an empty suffix, you can benchcraft up to 20% dot multi and make a really nasty claw. Keep in mind, you can and should override attack speed crafts with Chaos dot multi. Just make sure when you're buying claws that you're getting high damage ones and not high DPS ones that have really high attack speed. Don't get tricked by the attack speed effectively and scammed out of some of your currency. You can get some attack speed on the claw if it's like non-negotiable and it's just there and the claw is otherwise good. It's not too big a deal, but we get plenty of attack speed elsewhere for the build, so it's really not needed on the weapons. You can get a lot more damage on a much tighter budget without getting attack speed claws. For buying weapons, ideally you want to use Path of Building's buy items for this slot feature. I have a guide for that for jewels, but the same process works for claws as well. Check the description for any links that I mentioned during this video. Here's an example of a claw upgrade I got while working on this guide, actually. My previous claws were around 1 divine each, but I had farmed up a nice surplus, so here's a claw listed for 2 divines. I found this through Path of Building's trade for this items feature. I set it to total DPS, I put in a 3 div budget, and then I sorted by total sum. A Copy pasting this in the Path of Building, it's a nice 4.5% damage increase over my old claw. Pretty good boost for the price at this point in the build. But notice that this claw has crafted attack speed. On Path of Building, I edited the item to simulate changing it to Chaos.multi, which instead gives 7.1% DPS increase. And that craft only costs 4 Chaos. So naturally, after running the simulation, I immediately purchased the claw, crafted it, and threw in my character for a nice boost. You should do the same process and just scale it to your budget at the time. If it's just 100 Chaos, put in 100 Chaos, and buy something within your budget. Just make sure that Path of Building is accurately set up to simulate your damage. Now I want to mention Rebuke of the Vile because I get asked about it all the time, and a lot of people on PoE Ninja are using it. I personally love claws for the sustain and easy mana solution they give you, but I will say Rebuke of the Vile is definitely a great budget option for just getting high damage in this build. If you go for dual rebukes, obviously drop the claw nodes, and you'll have to get some sort of like minus mana cost ring or two to smooth out the mana. But if you can solve that, then they're a very strong enough item to use long term for the budget that they cost. Go for like a low attack speed, high damage roll one. That all said, my current claws are already stronger than very well rolled rebukes, and you can get much stronger claws than mine eventually as well. Just getting like 40 plus dot multi or faster poisons from Hunter, for example, in addition to really high tri-elemental, just ends up beating out Rebuke long term. So again, a good budget option, but not what you want to stick with long term, and personally I used claws the whole way. Next up, helmets. The helmet slot is a good place to get 3 things: accuracy, intelligence, and physical damage taken as elemental damage. That physical taken as elemental is kind of a key defensive layering on Pathfinders and builds in general, but particularly in our setup here, so it's something we'll be putting in as many places as we can get it. You can benchcraft the fizz taken as, and then use Eater of Worlds currency to roll the fizz taken as implicit. I went for fire so that I could stack it and use a ruby flask, and notice how I paired fire damage recouped with life as well. Mwah, delicious. Unless you're using a lightning coil, which I'll talk about later, aim for fizz taken as fire or cold to synergize with either a ruby flask or a taste of hate. I run both ruby and taste of hate so that I can use both of those elements primarily. Note that while you can get suppression on helmets, it's a suffix, and those slots are already pretty full between int, accuracy, and resist, so I recommend getting suppression elsewhere. Now let's talk about body armor, a somewhat controversial slot with my decision perhaps. Getting your 6 link is the priority above all else, and basic 6 links are very cheap. The current League and Nemesis rare conversion stuff is just crapping them out everywhere. I got like 14 6 links from one monster earlier. So your basics is just 6 link life, life percent, resist, and suppression. Pretty easy to do. When you upgrade later on, you want to upgrade to the Veiled modifier, Fizz taken as fire and lightning damage. It's a hybrid mod, it has both effects, so 16% total. Or you want to benchcraft the 5 to 6% version, which gives you 12% total. If you do the benchcraft though, you can't then craft percent life, so that's a fair bit weaker. So ideally you want to get the Veiled modifier version. You can also get influenced, like Elder Influence and so on, Fizz taken as elemental damage options. This is less preferred because it blocks Eater and Exarch implicits, and those are quite powerful on chests, so I don't recommend it, but that is an option. Getting the Veiled version of Fizz taken as probably means buying a really well rolled rare and then 6 linking it yourself, which can be kind of annoying, and I know not everyone's a fan. To be honest, my 6 linking this league was abysmal, it cost me 2,000 fuse. This is all doable, but the options on the market can be a little narrow. If you're having trouble finding good options, drop suppression from this item slot and get it elsewhere. Even the tree, making up with some nodes, there's spare nodes on the tree that I haven't picked up that you can get more suppression from. For the implicit, settle for whatever you get that is good. Keep an eye out for Grace and Malevolence aura effect and maximum resistances in particular, those are really nice. So let's talk about the controversial part of this choice of me running a rare chest. It's generally accepted that Lightning Coil is insane on Pathfinders. And it is true, I've done the comparisons, it is more maximum physical damage taken and a little bit more of an effective life pool, but the pressure Lightning Coil puts on your build, all of the other item slots need to have a lot more resistances. That means a lot of less suffixes you can play around with, and it's just so unfun gearing for Lightning Coil. I really dislike the item overall. But that said, again, it's generally accepted Lightning Coil is very good and it will make you tank fizz damage a bit better. Personally, I don't think we need it. We get a more general, like a more kind of overall nice feeling character and better to gear character at a better budget, I think. If you don't get unlucky with 6 linking, that is. With a rare chest, I like rolling the implicits. I think overall it's a lot more fun to do. If you do run the lightning coil, make sure you run a Topaz Flask alongside it to better mitigate that 50% converted lightning damage. Honestly, with feeling how my setup is played, I don't mind losing a little bit of fizz mitigation for much easier gearing overall, and still overall very good defense. I also make up a little bit of the difference in physical mitigation through some endurance charge setup I'll talk about in the passive tree section. The choice is yours though. Go lightning coil, go rare chest. Play it your way. Next up, gloves. Budget version is mandatory stat is the implicit skills, strike skills, target an additional enemy. That's an Exarch currency. You can actually roll that with the cheapest version of the currency, so do that. It's pretty cheap, and that is your main priority. Otherwise, you can get life, resist, accuracy, and flat added damage, and then later on upgrade to get more suppression and higher damage and accuracy rolls. And there's an Eater implicit for mark effect, very good, or slower wither expiry, still pretty good. For boots, your budget boots look like 25% plus movement speed with high life and resist. You can get away with a little bit lower movement speed because we have a ton of move speed in this build thanks to like a boosted silver or quicksilver if you want even more. Later on though, you can upgrade into a pair of boots with the Eater implicit, faster poison, very nice. And you can also use essences to get avoid elemental ailments. These boots, like mine, are actually very easy to craft and like a very big power gain, allowing you to easily get full elemental ailment avoidance with a setup I'll talk about later on. If you want to craft them for yourself, check out my boot crafting guide for how to do that, linked in the description. It's very easy. You have great craft to do, like a great aspirational endgame craft to get into that's super accessible. For amulets, your budget amulet is life resistances, stat requirements you need. You can get some damage over time multiplier, and then whatever cheap anointed passive you want, like beef or something. So just stick with your fairly cheap ammies for a while, just using the slot to get a little bit of what you need and maybe a little bit of boosted damage. Do this until you can save up a few divines for an Ashes of the Stars. It's a huge damage increase thanks to the way it scales some of the super effective quality improvements on some of our skills. Like for example, giving more wither stacks on Withering Step, mark effect on Alchemist Mark, less damage taken on Petrified Blood, and straight up more damage on Mamba Strike. It's a big goal item for the character, and it's well worth working towards and well worth the price it is right now. Plus, it's not like we could use them in previous league. They were like 40 divines. Now they're like 4 divines for a well-rolled one. Take advantage of it. It's good to finally have access to something like this. Now for the Anoint, while there are some pretty solid damage notables, you can anoint on enemies, and feel free to go if you want. I'm a big fan of the Anoint only node, Hardened Scars. It scales our life flask, and it gives something rare and valuable that's hard to get. Dot mitigation. With this node and your flask up, you can out-heal most damage over time effects, which lets you ignore or survive lots of nasty stuff in this game. Highly recommend. For rings, the budget versions just look like life, lots of resists, and a bit of strength or int if needed, and then with any extra prefixes you have empty, adding some extra damage to attacks or the Benchcraft elemental damage hybrid mods. When you want to upgrade, you can add things like higher damage rolls, and then some utility nice options like a minimum frenzy charge with frenzy charge generation unveil, and even the minimum endurance charge veil or craft as well. With a claw setup, we don't need minus mana cost, but if you go swords or something, you may need to do that on rings. For the belt, your budget belt just looks like high life, resistances, and strength. Make sure you try and get some chaos res where possible, especially this league, in whatever slots you can, and belt can be a good place for that. For your upgrade, you really want a Stygian Vise. They are a ton of value thanks to the ease of Abyss Jewels in adding damage to this build. Life, triple added flat damage on the jewel is quite accessible and pretty valuable in terms of what it gives you. That said, you can also get some nice utility stuff in here too, like phasing on kill. It's a good idea to have some source of phasing in general in Path of Exile that's active volume mapping, be it from a jewel mod or a flask or something else, so always try and check that box. For jewels, you can use Path of Buildings buy items for these slots to find the highest DPS jewel for your budget. I have a guide on that process if you want to learn how to do it yourself. Highly recommend. Now let's talk about flasks and tinctures. This is a Pathfinder, so the flasks are super important. The tincture is good enough to sacrifice a flask slot though, which is pretty wild. The life flask first is often overlooked, but very important to the build and a huge source of survivability. Thanks to Master Surgeon in the Pathfinder, our life flask can always be active even when our life is full. So you can pre-flask or you can reactively flask, generally a combination of the two. Getting a well-rolled life flask makes a huge difference, especially in combo with Petrified Blood. You can effectively stagger the damage and then out-heal it. Eternal Life Flask is stronger heal over time, but it's a very short duration and much more spammy. So if you don't want to be pressing your Life Flask every under 2 seconds, then you might want to go for a Divine Life Flask, which after playing with both for a while, the Divine is definitely more comfortable. You want to get over quality on your Life Flask from Hillock in Research in Betrayal. Quality on Life Flask gives more healing rather than duration, so it's very good. That said, you can also just buy a 28 or 30% quality flask from trade. Make sure you get an item level 82. The best Life Flask, in my opinion, is more recovery if used while on low life. With Petrified Blood, it's an insane amount of healing and has no other drawbacks. You would just get a normal healing when you pre-flask, but then when you actually take a ton of damage and need giga boosted healing, you will get more than double heal from activating it whenever you're in your Petrified Blood range. You're actually really tanky in that below half life period with Petrified Blood, so it works exceedingly well in my opinion. The comfiest flask, if you want to press the button the least amount of times, is Saturated. This is just increased amount recovered at a reduced rate, so it lasts longer but heals more. The heal per second is a bit lower on that setup though, keep in mind, so you're not going to be able to survive as scarier situations, but your Life Flask use will be more comfortable. If you're okay with a few of those above results, crafting your own Life Flask is honestly pretty easy, and especially if you actually sell the other good results that you don't want. Well-rolled flasks, Life Flasks, like Divine Life Flasks, actually sell for like 50 to 100 chaos if you don't know. Took me 3 attempts and I sold the previous 2 for like 80 chaos. For your other flasks, Taste of Hate is best in slot, giving huge amounts of physical and cold defense. Don't worry about the damage roll, it's not enough to worry about at all. Just aim for the best fizz taken as cold roll that you can. Outside of that, your other utility flasks are somewhat up to your preferences. Go for some artistic expression here. If you have a lot of one type of fizz taken as X damage, then run the corresponding flask to boost your defense. I run a Ruby because I have 32% fizz taken as fire, and as such it gives me more than 5% effective hit points and a huge boost to fire mitigation. I sometimes swap out a Topaz flask if specific content demands it, like a lightning boss fight for example. Generally though, I run a Silver flask for the scaled up onslaught effect. It's a good split between move and attack speed, and it along with frenzy charges and multi-strike is all the attack speed I really need for the build to feel great. Make sure you quality and instill your flasks so that they're up all the time. It's worth doing this right even though it's a little bit annoying to do. The only one of my flasks that actually really ever drops briefly is the Silver flask, and only really in boss fights. For the instill enchantments, reused at the end of flask effect is a good auto flask option, and so is used whenever flask charges reached full as well. For Taste of Hate, I use the activate on hitting a rare or unique monster, as it's very efficient and convenient, but sometimes I manually pre-use the flask just by pressing the button for mitigation in other situations too. For the Tincture, it must be Poisonberry so that we can scale with elemental damage, and ideally you want one with over 200% increased poison damage on non-poison enemies. Put it in your flask slot and activate it, and you want to nestle it in between 2 of your best flasks. This is because of the Oath of the Magi node that boosts the adjacent flasks to the Tincture. Now let's talk about the passive tree. I've included 3 passive trees in Path of Building. The leveling one just shows what to get before you swap to Mamba Strike. The non-cluster version shows what you can spend your points on before you get cluster jewels. Use the compare feature to see it at a glance. That said, I recommend getting clusters as soon as possible, and they're not that expensive to get going. It's almost double damage, so you really want to rush it. Now when following Path of Exile passive trees, I'm a big believer in experimentation and getting things as you feel your build needs them, so I'm not going to go node by node, but I'll point out some key nodes, masteries, and jewels to socket. Strength and intelligence are a little problematic when swapping gear around, especially early on. You can get some on Primal Spirit and the 30 plus nodes above Ranger. Use the Poisonous Fangs Claw Mastery for 25 mana on hit to almost completely solve mana. You later on also want to get the Life Mastery, 30% life cost conversion, to help smooth out mana as well. It makes things like activating Mark on Hit and running Precision easier. The Flask Mastery, remove non-elemental ailments, lets you solve bleed and poison with just your regular Life Flask usage. Do note though that this doesn't work on Corrupting Blood as it's not considered an ailment. GG please. And get a Corrupting Blood immunity jewel, ideally. The Corrupted Implicit, it's best to get on cheap jewels. Or just run Bleed Corrupt removal suffix on your Life Flask like I do. The biggest single passive for damage in the tree is the Poison Mastery for 300% damage on an unpoisoned enemy. Get it right away. The Accuracy Mastery, 50% more accuracy at close range, which is 2 meters, perfect for our build. This basically solves accuracy for 4 points. You almost don't need any accuracy on gear with this, though a decent roll here or there can help. There's a lot of suppression on the tree here, which makes capping easy with only 1 or 2 low roll suppression mods on gear. If you get more, great, you can maybe free up some passives. You can get even less suppression on gear if you use the evasion mastery for another 15% suppression if you're wearing all evasion gear, which you will be. Make sure to cap your suppression in endgame. It's one of the best defensive layers in Path of Exile. You can disable boss and rare monster critical strikes through the Mark Mastery. The poison option that is usually used in these builds just isn't very good because our poisons are such short duration. The Arrow Dancing Keystone is optional. I find projectiles more dangerous in the content I tend to do, so I take it so that I die to them less, but try it and see how you feel. For the Ascendancy trees for Pathfinder, you want to get the Poison Proliferation first, then Nature's Adrenaline and Master Surgeon, and then from Uberlab you want to get the Increased Effective Withered. It's a big damage boost, but you don't need that until late game. For the Magi Ascendancy, you want to get Oath of the Magi for leveling, and then Coated Blade to run your tinctures, and then Nature's Concoction. It'll probably take you a long time to get your 7th and 8th points, but you don't really need them. I just spend them on the Vivid Wisps, since there's nothing else that I need in there. If you want to, while leveling, you could run like Bark Skin for a while, but it's really not necessary. I just get Detect Evil for the other points, just to ignore block in Expedition, pretty much it. It puts minimap markers on your map, it really is kind of nothing. It's impressive how strong tinctures are that this entire Ascendancy is worth running, even though we only really spend 4 points in it. I will say though that the yellow Wisp stuff and juicing that up in maps is very good, so I don't mind getting those 2 10% nodes. It helps with map juicing. So next up, let's talk more about like jewels and clusters and stuff. So Lethal Pride is a very good idea and a use for a jewel slot, and it can generally actually be pretty cheap for a decent one. It solves strength requirements, which is great, and it does this by just giving you a bunch of free strength, but you can also get more physical taken as fire damage on it as well as some other things. Use the Find Timeless jewel down in the... Use the Path of Building button Find Timeless jewel down the bottom, and then make sure that the Ranger jewel socket is open. Select Lethal Pride and then the jewel socket, and make sure to click Filter Nodes. Then click the Search for Node dropdown to select Life, Percentage Strength, and Fizz Taken as Fire. I recommend changing the 1 next to Fizz Taken as Fire to 3 to increase its value weighting relative to the other options. And then you want to click Search down at the bottom. Now you can mouse over each jewel on the market auto-sorted by value to you. Try and find a couple nice options and then copy the trade URL and open that page and then find the number you want. If the first page is too expensive or unavailable, click the next trade URL and check out those next list of jewels. A jewel with 2 nodes that you've got allocated, Fizz Taken as Fire, with a life or a strength roll shouldn't be more than a divine or so, sometimes even less, but you may have to actually check a few lists to find it. If you really have trouble, add a few more options to the list of desired nodes to expand your potential market. Things like fire resistance and reduced damage taken from crits are not super high value, but they are things you can supplement your jewel with to help you find one. Next up, Ancestral Vision. We use this for Elemental Ailment Immunity. It's pretty cheap, only about 60 chaos or so, and that price seems to be coming down. It gives Elemental Ailment Avoidance based on half of your suppression, which we obviously get a lot of, so it's at least 50%. One of these and an Essence of Loathing on boots basically gives you like full immunity to all elemental ailments. It's great value. You can also get specific ailment avoidance on some jewels. You can also supplement or alternatively get specific ailment avoidance on some jewels and cap out that way. I like the boot option the most though. Until you get one of these and cap out ailment avoidance, manage freeze with Pantheon powers and the rest with flask modifiers. That which was taken is a very cool, unique jewel. Can be a little pricey for a good one, but you can find good 3-stat ones for a pretty good budget, usually about a divine. It has a lot of good power and quality of life options, things like Wither Effect and Culling Strike, for example. My jewel is a pretty good example of a fairly good one. I'll include a PoE trade search that looks for viable 3-stat options for you to peruse, so take a look through the list and see if anything there looks like it's worth a jewel slot to you. For other jewels, you want to use my guide to find DPS upgrading jewels and add mandatory clauses for life or other utility stats that you want. Regular jewels have damage over time multiplier, life, and faster poison, and Abyss jewels are all about that flat added damage and life. Now for cluster jewels, the budget option for the large is just literally any chaos damage or claw and dagger with 8 points maximum. Add in some notables if you want, but it's really not a big deal and you'll want to replace this after a while anyway. That's because a 5 passive voices has 3 medium cluster sockets, which is where we get our real damage. 5 passive voices are about a divine and well worth every bit of that as it gets us another cluster, and you'll see how impactful those are. So for the mediums, you want chaos damage over time with 4 or 5 passives. Both are fine, don't search just for 4 passives, as you're kind of scamming yourself. The only notable that truly matters is low tolerance. Each one of these nodes gives you a total DPS boost of between 20 to 40%, depending on the rest of your build. You could almost make an argument for running 6 of these, and I wouldn't really argue with that much. That said, 3 feels like a good balance without too much sacrifice. Low tolerance mediums are only like 30 chaos, but ideally you pair them with any other useful notable. I like Brood for potency and exposure therapy, for example, if you don't have capped chaos resistance. Flow of Life is also fine, and wasting Affliction is the best second DPS notable you can get, but those are quite expensive. I'll include a link for cheap double notables, but make your priority just getting your low tolerances online. In the small sockets, you're mostly better off putting Abyss or regular jewels. That said, I'm fond of the armor small with 2 passives with the notable enduring composure. Even on an evasion build, this basically keeps your max endurance charges all the time, and this is kind of how I make up the little bit of difference in fizz mitigation between my rare chest and lightning coil. It feels super worth the 2 extra passives that it costs. A note on Watcher's Eye, usually something I'd include in builds, but here, very expensive. Faster ailment or dot multi Watcher's Eyes, it just costs so much money, and that's the ones that are only really worth using. With how good Abyssal Jewel's in this, just use an Abyss Jewel instead. You're getting way better, like performance to price ratio there. If you do want to max out the DPS charts on PoE Ninja with this skill, then your answer is to drop more of the regular tree and get a second 5 passive cluster jewel, and then another 3 mediums with low tolerance. That will give you quite a lot of damage. There is some diminishing return, but it's probably still quite worth it just for raw damage. But at that point, you probably are sacrificing some defenses somewhere. I personally like a more well-rounded build, but that's a route you could go to juice up single target for uber bosses, for example. For the Pantheon, Brine King upgraded for freeze immunity is your best early option, and to be honest, I really want to swap to upgraded Lunaris for the extra mitigation, but I just can't drop Brine Kings because of the stun resilience it gives. I just hate getting chain stunned. If you solve stun in some other way, then you can swap to Lunaris. For the minor Pantheon, Raslatha gives us good stuff for Life Flask and dampens empowered rare monster regen, which is pretty annoying. It's a solid choice, and none of the other ones really do that much, since we solve most of our ailments through other means. Okay, now let's talk scaling. There are 2 keys to scaling damage in Path of Exile. Understanding your skill and its mechanics well, and the other one is using Path of Building effectively. If you really want to get good, this takes a bit of practice and actually physically going through the steps to compare and test different options. Set up your Path of Building, compare one claw to another, compare one passive cluster to another, and so on. Learn to use the trade for these items tool effectively as well. Honestly, my build's DPSs have all improved dramatically since I started learning how to use Path of Building properly. For this build, in particular, you're going to do the following things to scale damage. Getting added flat damage, especially elemental damage as it rolls higher. Compressing the duration of poison with faster poison and support gems. Stacking increased and more poison chaos damage over time sources, things that scale just the poison. Withering enemies to increase their chaos damage taken. This is scaling Withering Step. And then scaling the effect of our Alchemist Mark is also a pretty big one too. Nearly everything you do to boost your damage in this build will tackle one of those 5 things. But that said, there is something you can fine-tune and min-max to boost single target further than I have. It's not strictly necessary, but it's nice especially if you want to go into more bossing. This is the interaction of attack speed and duration. If your poison duration is longer than your attack time, you will hit and not poison the already poisoned enemy. Generally speaking, because we're speeding up and compressing our poison so much, and because we aren't really focusing on attack speed too much, this isn't a big deal, as our duration should be quite a bit lower than our attack time in most setups with this build. For example, my current character, in my current setup, I attack every 0.24 seconds, and according to Path of Building, my poison duration is 0.17. So there's a decent little gap there. Don't rely on the in-game poison duration, by the way. Path of Building is much closer to the truth, I find. So this means that there is a little gap when I'm wailing on a boss where they aren't poisoned between my attacks. 0.07 of a second. Doesn't sound like much, but as a fraction of the total amount of poison time, it's still a decent chunk. So you can either increase the duration or increase the attack speed to narrow this gap to give you more single target, effectively more poison uptime. This is why Path of Building tends to really highly recommend any duration nodes, as it really wants you to cap out your duration to attack speed to maximize your single target. If I did so in my current setup by just like simulating getting 1000% duration just to cap it out, I'd go from 5.9 million Pinnacle boss DPS to 7.4 million. An appreciable difference, and pretty worth min-maxing a bit if you do plan on doing a lot of bossing. If you really want to push this even further, you get as much faster poison as possible to make that duration as small as possible, and then pair that with more attack speed and then scale your duration after you run out of attack speed to sync it up as much as possible. The more you compress your poison, the more duration scaling and attack speed you can get effectively until you have as close to possible as full attack speed poison uptime. By the way, don't stress too much about the idea of sometimes hitting and not poisoning an already poisoned enemy. It's not ideal, but all that really matters is that your poison uptime is good, and some superfluous attacks are not really that big a deal, since you'll likely be attacking pretty fast anyway. Tinkering with duration and attack speed to optimize is only really necessary, again, for single target bossing. It can affect your proliferations a little bit, but that already does so much damage, it's likely often already hitting the damage over time cap anyway. So next up for survivability, in general you want to set up your Path of Building accurately and keep an eye on your effective hit points and the max hits of each damage type that you can take. You don't need quite as much Chaos max hit as the other types, as most Chaos damage is split with physical damage and tuned around lower damage amounts in Path of Exile, but that said, don't neglect it. I'm running like 40% Chaos resistance, and that's quite good here. Not represented in Path of Building at all really, except on maybe the calculations page, is damage over time, and that can be a real killer. Good Chaos resistance and bleed, cure, flask, or immunity to corrupting blood kind of takes care of a lot of damage over time in general content, but there's still some pretty nasty dots that can crop up. Ultimately, that's why I use Hardened Scars. If you're dying a bunch and you're following a pretty similar gear and skill setup, it's usually a couple things. Poorly rolled flasks is a big one. Poor flask usage, another one. They don't do anything if they're not active. Or it's a bit of a playstyle issue with how you engage monsters. You've got to keep moving in Path of Exile these days, and you want to move perpendicular to threats. You don't want to, like, you know, run away from the steam roller that's coming to run you over. You want to just run off to the side where it can't get you. Generally speaking, it's a good strategy to run in circles. In Path of Exile, running circles keeps you alive. But let's also talk about some big things if you want to become crazy tanky. Progenesis, the flask, gives you an extra petrified blood style effect on your character. It is the dream item for this build, giving something like 50% boost to effective hit points. We're already so tanky with that, we'll basically be immortal for most content. That said, it costs like 50 divines. It's actually a pretty good price for the amount of value it gives. It's like one of the most fairly priced items in Path of Exile, I feel. But yeah, that's a highly aspirational item for most people's budgets. Another option is the combo of Immutable Force with Blood Notch, and the ES Mastery stuns are based on Energy Shield instead of life. This does take some sacrifice though, and changes to the passive tree. Probably have to sacrifice a little bit of DPS, for example. And the price of this option is somewhere around the 3 to 5 divine range, depending on rolls. The results of this effectively though is about 50% damage mitigation for hits that don't one-shot you. It doesn't help with one-shot protection, but it instantly heals over half of the rest of hit damage that you take. It's very nice with Petrified Blood in particular. Personally, I didn't feel it was worth it. I've used this setup previously and it is very good, but I didn't want to make the sacrifices for it in this build, and we've got so much else going on, I didn't want to go for it. Also, I just feel kind of good enough without it, but definitely something to consider. Now finally, we're coming to the end. Leveling. I leveled with Caustic Arrow and Toxic Rain until Normal Labyrinth, where I picked up the Poison Prolif node. By that point, you should also have the Oath of the Magi node and the Splash and Strike target from between Duelist and Marauder. With this stuff, it's time to switch to Viper Strike. Use just random Fizz damage claws to level initially until you get the Tincture node and a Poison Berry Tincture. Basic ones are really cheap. Then you just want to use whatever high damage claws, probably Elemental, that have the highest total hit damage. Since you can use any damage type, there's tons of weapon options. Claws are my preferred base in mind because of the easy mana solve from the Claw Mastery and the life sustain they give you from their implicits. Stick with the life gain on hit where you can. At early endgame, I used 2 of the unique Claw Allure with Val Grace to zoom through low tier maps to rack up levels and some currency to upgrade my character. By this point in the league, though, there's probably some very cheap elemental claws you can get for like 5C that will just give you lots of damage for low-level maps. Did I mention bandits? No, there's so many things to remember in this. Kill all the bandits. Passives are premium in Path of Exile endgame these days. Okay, there you have it. This was a lot. It's over an hour of recording voice. Path of Exile is a complicated game now. If you really want to dive into a build, there's just so many things to consider, so many different variants and options, and if you really want to explain them properly, oh my lord. I'll tell you what though, it's very fun to immerse yourself in that process, and Path of Exile build creation right now is the best that it's maybe ever been. I love it. Hopefully I answered most of the questions you might have about this, and maybe you learned some things that you can take through to other builds, but hit me up in the comments for anything that I missed. I'm happy to help you out. And I don't normally bother to say this, but this was a very high effort video, so I'll make an exception. Hit that sub button and the like video. If you made it this far, you kind of owe me. That's it for now. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching.